Okay, today you're going to demonstrate the full pre-trip.
All right. As I approach the bus, I'm going to do an overall view of the bus. I'm looking for leaks and damage. And so under the engine transmission compartment, I see no dripping fluids or puddles. I check my front of the bus. I check my clearance lights. I check my student warning lights. I've got 2 amber and 2 red. I would check my turn signal and hazard lights, my headlights, high and low beam, all my reflective tape. All of my lights are clean, they're not cracked, broken, or missing, and they're all working properly. I would check my coolant. I would make sure that the fluid is at the proper level for operation if there are no leaks. I would check my power steering canister. I would check the dipstick to make sure the fluid is at the adequate level for operation. Make sure that there's no damage to the canister and make sure there are no leaks. I check my mirrors. I check all my flats, crossovers, student mirrors. I'm going to make sure that they are securely mounted. They're not cracked or broken. There are no loose fittings. I'd move to the side of the bus. I would check the driver's side of the bus. I check my clearance lights, my turn signal and hazard lights, my stop arm lights, my reflective tape, my 2 reflectors, 3 reflectors, 2 amber and 1 red. I'll make sure all my lights are clean, the proper color, they're not cracked, broken, or missing, and they're working properly. I would check my stop arms. I would make sure that they're securely mounted, that there are no loose fittings. I have 2 stop arms, one in the front and the back. I would check them both the same way. I would check my steering system. I got the steering gearbox and hoses. I would make sure they're securely mounted, that there are no missing nuts or bolts, that there's no leaks, and no damage. I would check the steering linkage from the front, from steering gearbox to the wheel assembly. I'd check the pitman arm, the drag link, the joints and sockets, and the tie rod end. I would make sure it's not loose, that it's not worn, that it's not cracked. I would make sure that, that there are no missing or loose bolts or cotter keys. I check my front brake assembly. I check my brake chamber. I would make sure it's securely mounted. I make sure that the hoses and fittings are tight, that they're not loose, that there's no leaks. I would check the brake drum. I would make sure that it's not cracked. I would make sure that it's not rusted. I would make sure that there's no holes or no welds. I would check make sure that the brake linings are not worn dangerously thin. I check the slack adjuster and push rod. I make sure that there's no more than 1 inch of free play. And I would check the clamp around the brake chamber and make sure that it's secured and that there are no leaks. I check my front suspension system. I would check it from front to back. I would check my leaf springs and make sure they're not cracked or missing, that the leaf springs are in alignment. I would make sure that the spring hangers are not cracked or damaged. And I would make sure that the spring mounts are securely mounted to the frame, the spring mounts. I would make sure both front and back that there are no missing nuts or bolts. I would also check the the brackets and the U-bolts and bushings and make sure that there are no missing bolts or nuts. I would check my front wheel assembly. I would make sure that minimum tread depth on the tires is 4/32 of an inch. I would make sure that the tread is worn evenly. I would make sure that there's no cuts or bulges on the sidewalls. I would check the rims. I would make sure that the rims aren't cracked, welded, that they're not rusted. I would check to make sure the lug nuts are all tight, that there are none missing, that there are no rust trails, and that there are no cracks. I would check the inner and outer hub wheel seal. I would make sure that they're securely mounted, that there are no leaks. I would check the mud flap and make sure that the mud flap is securely mounted. I would check under the bus. I would check my luggage compartments. I would make sure that they open freely, there's no damage to the hinge, and that they close securely. I would check my frame from front to back. I'm going to make sure there's no no bends, that it's not welded, there are no holes, that there's no damage to the frame. I would check all of the cross members from front to back and make sure that they're securely mounted, that they're not loose or missing, there's no missing nuts or bolts, and make sure there are no holes in the floor. I would check my drive shaft from front to back. The drive shaft and the U-joints. I would make sure that the U-joints they're free of foreign objects, that it's not bent, broken, or rusted, and I would make sure there's no missing nuts or bolts. I would check my exhaust system from front to back. I would make sure that the exhaust system is not cracked. I would make sure that it's not rusted through, there are no holes, that there's no damage to the exhaust system, that there are no leaks. I would make sure that the tailpipe extends beyond the side of the bus. I checked my rear suspension system. I would check all the same as the front of the bus. My torque spring arm, the airbags, the airline hoses, I would check to make sure that the airbags and the airline hoses are not cracked, damaged, or leaking, that they're securely mounted. And I check the hoses that come from there, make sure that they're not worn or cracked and that they're not leaking. Check the torque spring arm, the spring mounts, brake chambers, the brake drums, the brake linings. I'll check all the same as the front. I check the rear wheel assembly, the rims, the inner and outer axle seals, and the tires. I would check the same as the front, except on the back I can have the minimum tread depth can be no less than 2/32 of an inch. I would make sure that there's evenly spaced, that there's no obstructions between the tires, and then check those the same way as I check the front. Let's check the back of the bus. I've got a strobe light on top. Check my clearance lights. I check my student lights. I've got 2 amber and 2 red. I check my turn signal. These also act as my hazard lights. I check my tail lights. These also act as my brake lights. Check my backup lights. My license plate light. All my reflective tape. All my lights are clean, my reflectors too. I check. All my lights are clean, they're not cracked, broken, or missing, and they're all working properly. I check the emergency door. The door opens fully. Check that it latches securely. Make sure there's no damage to the handles. Make sure there's no damage to the hinges and no damage to the door seal. Make sure the door closes properly. I walk to this side of the bus. This side of the bus, I check the same as the other side of the bus. I would check the fuel tank, make sure that the cap is secure. I would check underneath and make sure that the mounting straps and the fuel tank are securely mounted. There's no damage and no leaks. The DEF tank, I check the same way. I would make sure that the cap is secure. The fuel tank, the mounting straps, I would make sure it's securely mounted, that there's no damage, and that there's no leaks. With the DEF tank, I would make sure it's at least 1/8 of a tank full. I would check the door. I would make sure that there's no damage to the door, that there are no obstructions, that it's clean. I would make sure that it opens properly, that there's no damage to the door seal. I would check the passenger entry. I would make sure that there's no loose or missing treads or screws. I would make sure that it's free of obstructions. I would make sure the step light works. I would make sure that the handrails are securely mounted. I would use my 3-point system to enter, which is 3 points of contact at all times to enter the bus. Okay, I check the water pump. I make sure that it's securely mounted, that there are no missing nuts or bolts, and that there are no leaks. I would check my alternator. I would make sure that it is securely mounted and make sure that there are no loose or frayed wires, and make sure it's securely mounted. And then I would also make sure that there's no missing nuts or bolts, and that the serpentine belt, I would check the serpentine belt. The serpentine belt should have 3/4 to 1 inch deflection. It should not be worn or cut or frayed. Okay, I would check the transmission fluid dipstick. I would make sure that the fluid is at the proper level for operation and that there are no leaks. I would check the oil dipstick. I would make sure that the fluid is at the proper level for operation and that there are no leaks. I would check all of my hoses, and I would make sure that there are no cuts or bulges, that they're not frayed, that they're all securely mounted, and that there are no leaks. I would check the air compressor and governor and make sure that it is securely mounted and that there are no leaks from the hoses. And so I would also check the power steering pump. I would make sure that it is securely mounted, the power steering pump is gear driven, and I would make sure that there are no leaks. So I would check the exhaust manifold. I would make sure it's securely mounted to the engine. There's no missing nuts or bolts. I would make sure there's no holes, no rust, and no damage. And then make sure it's not leaking. I would check my emergency equipment. I would check the first aid kit and make sure it's properly supplied. I would check my fire extinguisher. It's fully charged when the arrow is in the green. I would check my 3 reflective triangles that are my warning devices. And I would check that I have extra fuses on the side. I would check the seat backs. I would check the seat bottoms and the seat frames. Make sure the frames are securely mounted to the floor, that the seats are securely mounted, there's no missing nuts or bolts. I would go ahead and check the seat backs, seat bottoms, and the seat frames. Check all of those the same way. I would check my emergency exit windows. I would make sure that they open properly, that the alarm sounds, and that they close properly. I would check all 6 exit windows the same way. I would check my emergency roof hatches. I have 2, one in the front and one in the back. I would make sure that they open properly, that the alarm sounds, that they close properly. I would check my emergency exit door, make sure it opens and the alarm sounds when it's open, that it closes properly. Okay, I would check my seat belt. and make sure that it's securely mounted, that it works properly, the belt is not frayed or damaged, and it fastens securely. I would do a safe start of the bus. I would make sure that the bus is in neutral, that the parking brake is applied, that my foot is on the brake, and I would start the bus. And now close my door. I would now check my mirrors. I check my flats, my convex, my student mirrors. I would all make sure that they're adjusted properly, that they're clean and not broken, and there's nothing obstructing my view. I would check my windshield. I would make sure the windshield is not cracked or broken, that there are no obstructions, and that it's clean. I would check my windshield wipers. I would make sure the wiper itself is not cracked or worn, that they operate properly, and that the washer works. Okay, I would check my driver heater. I would make sure that it works in low, off, and high position. I would check my passenger heaters. My front passenger heater, I would make sure it works in low, off, and high position. My mid heater, low, off, high position. And my rear passenger heater, low, off, and high position. I would check my defrost fan. I would make sure it works in low, medium, and high position. I would check all of my gauges. I would make sure that the oil pressure gauge is sufficient for operation. It should be around 40 psi. I would check that the alternator is working properly, that it's charging the voltage between 12 and 14 volts. And then I would make sure that the engine temperature is between 170 and 200 degrees, 210 degrees operating temperature, and that my air pressure is charging sufficiently. I would check my turn signals. My left turn signal works properly inside the bus and outside. I would check my right turn signal. It works inside the bus and outside. My hazard lights, I would check to make sure that they work inside the bus and outside. I would turn my headlights on. My clearance lights come on when the headlights are on. I would check my student warning lights. I would check the amber student warning lights, and I make sure it works outside of the bus and on the panel. I would open the door, and I would make sure that the stop arms come out and that the red lights are activated outside the bus and inside the bus. And then I would make sure the step light works. I would close the door and make sure the system shuts down properly. I would put the bus in drive, apply the parking brake, attempt to move the bus forward. The bus should not move, and the bus does not move. To test the brakes, I would put the bus in drive, release the parking brake, and move the bus forward approximately 5 miles per hour in a forward motion. And when I apply the brakes, the bus should not steer from left to right. I will do this later during my drive test.
Okay, Keith, so now we're ready to do your air brake check, okay? Take your time, think about what you're doing, step by step, and you'll get through it.
I'm now going to do my air brake check. To start the test, I'll pump the brakes down to approximately 90 psi. The air compressor will build the air pressure up sufficiently fast enough to charge the system, and the governor should cut out between 120 and 140 psi. My needles have stopped increasing, indicating the governor is cut out. I'm now going to shut the bus off, put the bus back into the battery charge position. I'm going to release the parking brake. I would chock the wheels if necessary to keep the bus from rolling. I'm now going to firmly apply my foot to the foot brake, and I'm going to hold it for 1 minute. I can lose no more than 3 psi in 1 minute on a single vehicle. The time is now 10:10. Okay, the time is now 10:11, and I've had no loss of air. I'm now going to continue pumping the brakes until the air pressure drops below 55 psi, where I'll verify that the low air pressure warning, alarm, and lights activate as it crosses 55 psi. My low air pressure warning lights and alarm activated when I cross below 55 psi. I'm now going to continue pumping the brakes down to approximately 20 to 40 psi, where my emergency pop-out valve will apply. My emergency pop-out valve popped out. My air brake test is now complete.